tweeted reminding the protesters in the streets in many cities across the country tonight, make it clear that the problem of police shootings is not just confined to Minnesota or Louisiana. And joining us now is Cornell Brooks, president of the NAACP. Thanks for joining us tonight. Well, let me just ask you, big picture about the responses we've seen here, the political response we've seen in Louisiana, the investigation already turned over to the Justice Department, calls for that in Minnesota. That's not necessarily the case, at least right now, in Minnesota. But what do you make of the response to both of these incidents?
Well, the response largely has been one by the protesters of grief and determination. The response by those in authority is one of grim recognition of the problem. Namely this, we have a form of policing all across the country that has resulted in a young black man being 21 times more likely to lose his life at the hands of the police than his white counterparts. Those are the facts. We understand that all across this country, there are police officers who see black skin as a robe of vulnerability and victimhood, and see white skin as a kind of flak jacket of credibility and respectability. And over again, after one horrible video after another, one hashtag after another, we see young African Americans profiled and victimized. And so the recognition on the part of the authorities is often late and insufficient. The fact that the Justice Department is involved and looking at these tragedies is good. It is heartening. But the challenge is, what is being done in these state legislatures? What is being done in terms of passing racial profiling laws? What is being done in terms of establishing standards for excessive use of force? What is being done with respect to training police officers to treat African Americans as objects, not objects of predation, but rather subjects of protection? Those are the kinds of questions that have to be answered in real time. And that means people in communities all across the country of every hue and every heritage calling upon their police departments to establish standards of accountability. And that means going to the polls in November and voting in a way to suggest that the way you protect us in the streets matters when we go to the polls. We cannot simply watch these videos one after the other, wringing our hands or scratching our heads in moral befuddlement. We have to take decisive action, and that means across the country. This is a moment. We're in the middle of a post-millennium civil rights movement where we see activists in the streets, we see civil disobedience in Congress, we see a hue and cry from the public for reform. But reform means specific policy reforms in legislatures, at the state level, and certainly in Congress.
Well, what about in Minnesota? Take a look at what the governor had to say there today. He said he was offended that this had happened in his state. He said he looks at it and asks himself, if this motorist were white, would this have happened? He said he concludes, no, this wouldn't have happened if the motorist were white. He talked about problems of racial injustice at this press conference, though. We just heard from Danny Givens on the scene there in St. Paul, a friend of Philando Castile. He said he listened to the governor today and he didn't buy it. What did you think of what the governor had to say?
Well, I will simply say the governor's words are true to the extent that he recognized the grim reality that a white person with a broken tail light, with a license to carry a firearm, would not likely be subject to having their life taken beside their fiance with a little girl in the back seat. That is not highly likely. So the governor acknowledged that. But I too have sat in a meeting with the governor. People measure governors, they measure mayors, they measure congressmen and congresswomen and senators by their legislative actions, by the policies and reforms they bring about. We've had enough talk. We've had enough sound bites on all sides. What we have to move to is specific reform. Where we have seen in the last year 1,000 people die in police custody. This year, thus far, over 500. What do? Do we wait till the next tragedy, to the next hashtag, to the next video, or do we move decisively? Note this, in the last century, the NAACP stood against a form of racialized violence called lynching. We brought that largely to an end. In this century, we are dealing with a form of racialized violence called police misconduct. We can bring this to an end, but we've got to do so by using our political power, using our economic power, turning out at the polls and enacting legislative reform, policy reform at the municipal level, at the state level, and at the federal level.
All right, Cornell Brooks, president of the NAACP. Thanks for the time tonight.
Oh, thank you.
All right, we're going to keep an eye on the protests now taking place across the country tonight at the end of what has been a very busy news day, also with many political developments today.